Eerie aerial drone shot descending over a quiet Pacific Northwest neighborhood at night. Porch lights flicker. A police cruiser's lights pulse silently in the distance. Slow dissolve into archival-style yellow crime scene tape rippling in the wind. Old newsprint fades across the screen. Headlines about a missing girl. For 3 decades, this brutal murder remained one of America's most baffling mysteries. Detectives chased countless leads, questioned dozens of suspects, and watched every clue disappear, until one microscopic DNA sample changed everything. Fog rolling through tall evergreens, a bicycle wheel, half buried in leaves, catches the moonlight. In the summer of 1986, a 13-year-old girl named Jennifer Bastian pedaled her new bicycle into a park in Tacoma, Washington, and never came home. For 32 years, her killer walked free, hidden behind an ordinary life, an ordinary name, an ordinary face in a crowd. Investigators printed his case on playing cards and handed them to prison inmates, hoping someone, somewhere, would remember something. They didn't know that the answer was already sitting in an evidence locker, waiting for science to catch up. This is the story of how a single strand of genetic material, overlooked for years, misunderstood for years, finally spoke the name that thousands of hours of shoe leather investigation could not. A slow montage, a corkboard covered in decades of tip sheets, a rotary phone ringing unanswered, a filing cabinet drawer sliding shut, a single lit window in a dark house, late at night, curtains slightly parted. Somewhere in this city, in the summer of 1986, an ordinary-looking man went back to his ordinary life. He went to work. He ran errands. He may have even, at some point, called the police himself, offering to help. And for 32 years, nobody had any reason to suspect him at all. It's a case that touches almost every era of modern criminal investigation. It begins in an age of composite sketches, drawn by hand, and tip lines answered by rotary phone. It moves through the birth of DNA profiling, a technology so new in the late 1980s that most crime labs in the country didn't yet know how to use it. And it ends in an age of genetic genealogy, a science that didn't even have a name when this case began, but would ultimately become the tool that closed it. Along the way, this case would force investigators to unravel one of their own longest-held theories, chase a suspect list that grew to include more than 150 names, and wait, in the final stretch, more than a year for a single lab result to come back. It is a story about how long the truth can wait, and about the people who refuse to stop looking for it. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you up at night, wondering how justice finally catches up to the guilty, hit subscribe now. We publish a new deep dive cold case investigation every week, and you won't want to miss where this one goes. A suburban Tacoma street in late summer, sun low through the trees, a girl's bedroom, homework on the desk, a note in looping handwriting. Tacoma, Washington, August 4th, 1986. It was the kind of late summer afternoon that felt like it could stretch on forever. Jennifer Bastian, 13 years old, had just gotten a brand new 18-speed Schwinn bicycle, the kind of gift a kid remembers for the rest of their life. She told her parents she was going for a ride. She left a note. She'd be home by 6:30. A bicycle rolling down a tree-lined path into Point Defiance Park, sunlight flickering through the canopy. Point Defiance Park sat on a forested peninsula overlooking the Puget Sound. 5 square miles of old-growth trees, winding trails, and quiet beauty. For the people of Tacoma, it was a sanctuary. Families picnicked there. Joggers ran its looping roads every morning and evening. Kids like Jennifer rode their bikes along 5-mile drive without a second thought. It was the kind of place a parent could let a 13-year-old go alone, because generations of Tacoma families had done exactly that without incident. She was seen there that afternoon, more than once. Witnesses would later recall spotting a girl matching her description on her bike as late as 6 o'clock that evening, just half an hour before she was due home. To the people who saw her, there was nothing remarkable about the sighting at all. A girl on a new bike, riding the same loop hundreds of other kids rode every summer afternoon. Nobody who saw her that day had any reason to think it might be the last time. A kitchen table, a note in a child's handwriting, weighted down by a glass of water, a digital clock reading 6 p.m. Jennifer's parents didn't panic right away. 13-year-olds lose track of time. Bike rides run long. There was no reason, at first, to think this evening was any different from 100 others. But 6:30 came and went, and the ordinary explanations began, one by one, to run out. A clock on a kitchen wall ticking past 6:30, a porch light switching on, a mother stepping outside, scanning the street. 6:30 came, then 7, then 8. The Bastians began to understand, with the particular dread that only parents know, that something was wrong. They called the police. Flashlights sweeping through dark woods, volunteers moving in a search line through underbrush. What followed was one of the largest search efforts the city had seen. Police, park rangers, and hundreds of volunteers combed Point Defiance's trails and ravines. Friends and family stood outside grocery stores and along 6th Avenue, holding up photocopied flyers, a black and white photo of a smiling girl, asking anyone at all if they had seen her. For 24 days, Tacoma held its breath. A missing persons flyer taped to a storefront window, curling slightly at the edges from the summer heat. A phone bank of officers answering calls. The search consumed the city. Police brought in tracking dogs. Park rangers walked grid patterns through ravines and undergrowth that hadn't seen a flashlight beam in years. Volunteers who had never met Jennifer Bastian showed up anyway, because in a city that size, everyone seemed to know someone who knew her family. Her photograph, a school portrait, an easy smile, became the most recognized face in Tacoma that August, taped to bulletin boards, gas station windows, and telephone poles for miles around the park. Each day without an answer stretched the town's nerves a little tighter. Rumors moved faster than facts. Some believed she had run away. Her family never entertained that theory for a moment. They knew their daughter, and they knew the note she'd left, and none of it fit a girl who planned on disappearing. A wooded ravine off a park road, crime scene tape strung between trees. Investigators in windbreakers crouched near the ground. On August 28, 1986, that hope ended. Jennifer's body was discovered in a wooded area off 5 Mile Drive, not far from where she'd last been seen riding her bicycle. She had been strangled. The discovery closed one agonizing chapter and opened another, darker one. The community that had searched for her now had to grieve her, and to confront the terrifying reality that whoever had done this was still out there, walking among them. For a park that had always symbolized safety, that illusion was gone, and it would take more than 3 decades to get any of it back. Newspaper front pages fading in and out, headlines about a second Tacoma child murder, a map graphic highlighting 2 park locations across the city. To understand the terror that gripped Tacoma that year, you have to understand that Jennifer's murder wasn't the first. Just months earlier, in March of 1986, 12-year-old Michella Welch had gone missing from another North Tacoma park. Her body was found in Puget Park. She too had been sexually assaulted and killed. 2 young girls, 2 city parks, both within a matter of months. It felt, to investigators and to a terrified public alike, like there could only be one explanation: a single predator stalking Tacoma's children. A composite sketch artist's rendering, vague, shadowed male figure. Detectives pinning photographs to a corkboard, string connecting 2 case files. For years, that theory anchored the investigation. Detectives worked both cases in tandem, searching for a connection, a single suspect who could be tied to both crime scenes. Composite sketches were drawn. Tip lines rang constantly. And yet, month after month, year after year, no arrest came. A local news broadcast from 1986, a stern anchor delivering a report on the 2 murders, a chyron reading "Tacoma on Edge," parents pulling children closer at a park playground. The fear wasn't abstract. Parents stopped letting their kids bike to the park alone. School counselors fielded questions from children too young to understand what had happened, but old enough to sense that something had shifted permanently in their town. For an entire generation of Tacoma kids, Point Defiance and Puget Park would carry a shadow that never fully lifted, even decades later. Detectives, for their part, were working with the tools of 1986, tools that, compared to what would come later, look almost primitive. Fingerprint cards, hair and fiber comparisons under a microscope, witness canvases conducted door to door, on foot, with a notepad and a pen. It was rigorous work, and it was exhausting work, and for years, it produced page after page of eliminated suspects, and not one confirmed name. We're only a few minutes in, and if you want to be part of a community that takes these cases seriously, that treats victims as more than a headline, drop a comment below with where you're watching from tonight. It helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. A dim evidence room. Cardboard boxes on metal shelving, labeled and dated. Dust particles floating in a shaft of light. The years that followed tested the patience of a city desperate for closure. Detectives retired. New detectives inherited case files thick with dead ends. Jennifer's mother, Patty Bastian, became a fixture of quiet, relentless hope, the kind of grief that refuses to calcify into resignation. She told reporters, again and again, that she believed the case would someday be solved. She just didn't know when. A television playing an old true crime program, a stylized recreation of a 1989 broadcast. In December of 1989, Jennifer's case was even featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries, alongside the case of another slain Tacoma girl. For a moment, national attention turned toward Tacoma's twin tragedies. Tips poured in from across the country. None of them led anywhere. A detective's office, years later, a younger detective flipping through a thick, yellowing case file, dust rising off the pages. By the early 1990s, the case had gone cold in the coldest sense of the word. Not abandoned, but stalled, waiting on forensic technology that simply didn't exist yet. Detectives who inherited the file did so knowing they were, in many ways, just custodians of it, keeping it organized, keeping it alive, hoping that someday a new detective with a new tool would be able to pick up where they left off. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the file passed between investigators as retirements and reassignments reshaped the department. Each new detective read the same witness statements, studied the same composite sketches, and reached more or less the same conclusion. The case would not move forward until the evidence itself could tell them something the human eye couldn't see. What nobody could have predicted was just how much that evidence would eventually be capable of revealing, or how long it would take to get there. A modern forensic laboratory, gloved hands carefully unsealing an evidence bag containing a folded swimsuit, overhead fluorescent light glinting off stainless steel countertops. Here is where this case becomes, in many ways, a story about time itself, about the gap between what a crime scene contains and what science is capable of reading from it. When Jennifer's body was found in 1986, investigators recovered the swimsuit she had been wearing. It was preserved, catalogued, and stored, a piece of physical evidence that would sit largely untouched for nearly 3 decades, waiting for forensic science to evolve enough to unlock what it held. Close-up of gloved hands under a lab light, a swab, a small vial being labeled. In November of 2013, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab re-examined that swimsuit. In the years since 1986, the tools available to forensic scientists had transformed almost beyond recognition. Where investigators in the 80s could only note the presence of biological material, technicians in 2013 could isolate a complete male DNA profile from trace evidence in the fabric. A split-screen comparison. A 1986 forensic technician squinting through an early microscope versus a 2013 technician working at a fully automated DNA sequencer. To appreciate what a leap this was, it helps to understand just how far DNA forensics had come in less than 30 years. When Jennifer died in 1986, forensic DNA profiling as a police tool barely existed. The first criminal conviction using DNA evidence anywhere in the world wouldn't happen until the following year, and it would take most of the following decade for the technique to become standard practice in American crime labs. The scientists working Jennifer's case in the 80s were, quite literally, working before the tool that would eventually solve it had been invented. By 2013, forensic science had leapt forward on nearly every front. Smaller sample sizes, more sensitive amplification techniques, and profiling methods that could pull a usable genetic signature from material that would have been functionally invisible to investigators a generation earlier. The swimsuit that had waited quietly in an evidence room for 27 years suddenly had something new to say. A DNA double helix graphic rotating slowly, sequencing data scrolling on a monitor. That discovery did 2 things at once. First, it gave investigators a genetic fingerprint of Jennifer's killer, a profile that could, in theory, be matched against anyone in the world if the right sample ever crossed a lab technician's desk. Second, and just as important, it allowed investigators to finally test the long-standing theory that had shaped their work for nearly 30 years. Was the man who killed Jennifer Bastian the same man who killed Michella Welch? Two DNA profile graphics side by side on a screen, a red no-match indicator flashing between them. The lab compared the male DNA profile from Jennifer's swimsuit to genetic evidence from the Welch crime scene. They did not match. After decades of working from the assumption of a single killer, detectives now knew these were two separate men, two separate crimes, two separate investigations that had been unknowingly running in parallel. It was a gut punch of a discovery, an entire theory of the case, dismantled in a lab report. But it also sharpened the investigation. Detectives were no longer looking for one shadow, they were looking for two. An investigator running the new DNA profile through a database search interface. A results screen returns, "No match found." The new profile was run against state and national DNA databases. Nothing. Whoever had left that trace evidence on Jennifer's swimsuit had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to land his DNA in the system. He was, as far as any database was concerned, a ghost. A wall-mounted map of Tacoma, with pins marking both crime scenes. A detective standing back, arms crossed, studying it. For investigators, this was both a disappointment and a clarifying moment. A database match would have ended the case in an afternoon. Its absence meant the man they were looking for had never been fingerprinted for a felony, never swabbed during a prior arrest, never so much as flagged in any system built to catch people like him. It meant the search would have to go a different route entirely. Not backward, into existing records, but forward, into an active, door-to-door hunt for the one person on Earth whose DNA would match a sample that had been sitting in storage since Ronald Reagan was in his second term as president. A digital composite face slowly rendering on a screen, feature by feature, jawline, eye color, hair texture assembling from data points. By 2016, investigators turned to a technique that would have sounded like science fiction when Jennifer disappeared: DNA phenotyping. Working with a Virginia-based company, Tacoma detectives submitted the genetic profile from the crime scene and received something remarkable in return. Not a name, but a face. A computer-generated composite built directly from the killer's own genetic code. The analysis suggested a man of Eastern European and Northwestern European ancestry, likely with fair skin, light-colored eyes, and reddish or blonde hair, possibly with freckles. It wasn't a photograph, it wasn't a certainty, but it was the closest thing to a face that this case had ever had. Police releasing a printed composite sketch to a room of reporters. Camera flashes. Police released the composite publicly, alongside a second one generated for the still unsolved Welch case. For a city that had lived with these two names for 30 years, it was the first time either killer had anything resembling a face. A local newsroom control room, reporters gathering around a monitor as the composite images broadcast for the first time. Phones on desks beginning to light up. Local news outlets ran the composites for days. The department's public information officer told reporters, with a note of something like awe, that these two 1986 murders had occurred at a time when the technology being used to revisit them simply did not exist. It was an unusual thing for a police department to admit, that the case had waited, in part, not for a lucky break, but for the science itself to be born. A phone ringing at a police tip line, an officer picking up, writing on a notepad, and in a detail that still strikes investigators as almost too strange to be true, one of the tips that came into that renewed public appeal wasn't new at all. 30 years earlier, back in 1986, a local jogger had called Tacoma police about the Welch case, describing a man he'd seen while running through Point Defiance Park. That jogger gave his name. He was never arrested. He was, at the time, simply one voice among hundreds. His name was Robert Washburn. A grainy black and white photograph. An ordinary man, unremarkable, blending into a crowd. For 30 years, that name sat quietly in a case file, unconnected to anything, a footnote in an investigation that had moved on to other suspects, other theories, other leads. Nobody in 1986 had any reason to imagine that the man calling in a tip might be more than a witness to one of Tacoma's darkest chapters. He might be a participant in it. A jogger's silhouette running along a wooded park road at dawn, shot from behind, features obscured. According to police accounts, Washburn told officers in 1986 that he'd seen a man matching the release sketch while out jogging, something he said he did as often as twice a day, along the very trails where these crimes had occurred. It was a small, almost unremarkable detail in the flood of tips that came in that year. A local man, familiar with the park, offering an observation. There was no reason at the time to weigh it any differently than the dozens of other tips filed away in the same folder. It's one of the details that makes this case so unsettling in hindsight. The person Tacoma police would eventually charge with murder had, at one point, willingly walked into contact with the very investigation built around his own crime. We're at the halfway point now, and this is exactly where cold cases usually die. A name in a file, buried under 30 years of paperwork. If you want to see how investigators dug it back out, stay with us, and consider subscribing so this channel can keep bringing these stories the depth they deserve. An animated family tree graphic branching outward from a single unidentified profile at its base, nodes lighting up one by one. It's worth pausing here to explain what made this new era of cold case work so different from everything that came before it. Traditional DNA matching relies on a direct hit, comparing a crime scene profile against a database of people who have already been arrested or convicted of a qualifying offense. If the culprit was never in that database, a direct match is impossible, no matter how strong the evidence. Genetic genealogy works differently. Rather than searching for the person directly, investigators and genealogists build out a family tree from more distant genetic relatives, even third or fourth cousins, who have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to consumer ancestry services. By mapping those family connections and cross-referencing them against public records, age ranges and geography, investigators can narrow an enormous family tree down to a small handful of plausible candidates. From there, the work becomes traditional again: surveillance, records requests, and, in Jennifer's case, a direct request for a voluntary sample. It's a technique that essentially turns millions of ordinary people's curiosity about their own ancestry into an unintentional net for identifying violent offenders who might otherwise have stayed hidden forever. In Jennifer Bastian's case, this genealogical approach worked in tandem with the department's own suspect list-building effort, giving detectives two independent paths converging on the same pool of names. A cold case unit's office, evidence boards, decades-old file boxes stacked against a wall, a single detective working late under a desk lamp. In 2011, the Tacoma Police Department formed a dedicated cold case unit, and Jennifer Bastian's file became one of its priorities. Detective Lindsay Wade, who would go on to lead much of this renewed effort, began the painstaking work of rebuilding a 30-year-old investigation from the ground up, cross-referencing old tip sheets, re-interviewing surviving witnesses, and preparing the case for the moment forensic technology might finally deliver an answer. A corkboard filling up with photographs and names, red string connecting dozens of faces. By April of 2016, working alongside FBI genetic genealogists, investigators had compiled a list of persons of interest, men with some connection to the case, the neighborhood, or the original 1986 tip lines. It was an enormous undertaking. Rather than waiting for a lucky database hit, detectives decided to go directly to the people on that list and ask, one by one, for a voluntary DNA sample. A detective's desk covered in manila folders, each labeled with a name and a case number. A hand stamping one folder, sample requested. Building that list meant returning to every scrap of paper the case had ever generated, every 1986 tip, every name mentioned by a witness, every person who had ever lived near either park, worked near either park, or been questioned in the frantic weeks after either murder. It was, in effect, a second investigation layered on top of the first. Not new evidence, but a new way of organizing 30 years of old evidence, sharpened by the knowledge that somewhere in all that paperwork was a name that mattered. Between 2016 and 2017, FBI agents and Tacoma detectives fanned out across the country, knocking on doors that hadn't been knocked on in 3 decades. They collected DNA samples in batches, 20 at a time, and sent each batch to the crime lab for comparison against the profile recovered from Jennifer's swimsuit. An agent at a doorstep in a quiet Midwestern town, presenting identification, a swab kit being opened on a kitchen table. More than 150 people gave samples during this effort. It was a slow, grinding process. No dramatic breakthroughs, just batch after batch of negative results, each one closing a door rather than opening one. A lab tech loading a rack of small sample vials into a testing machine, one batch after another, calendar pages flipping in the background. Consider what that actually meant for the people doing this work, knocking on the door of someone who, more likely than not, would have absolutely nothing to do with the crime, explaining, gently and professionally, why the FBI and local police wanted a swab of their DNA for a murder that happened 3 decades earlier. Most people said yes without hesitation, relieved, in a strange way, to be able to help close a case that had haunted the region for so long. And batch after batch, the lab reported back the same result. Not this one. Not this one either. It would have been easy, after 100 names with no match, to wonder if the man they were looking for had died, moved out of the country, or was simply never going to appear on any list at all. On March 6, 2017, FBI agents arrived at a home in Eureka, Illinois, a small town east of Peoria, to speak with a 60-year-old man named Robert Washburn. He was the same man who, 31 years earlier, had called Tacoma police with a tip about the Welch case while it was still being actively investigated. A quiet, residential street in rural Illinois. A porch. A screen door closing. Washburn agreed to give a DNA sample voluntarily. He signed the consent form. The swab was taken, sealed, and shipped back to Washington State for testing. It was, at the time, simply one more sample in a long batch, number who knows what, out of more than 150. Nobody involved had reason to believe this particular swab was any different from the ones before it. A calendar, flipping through months. A lab technician methodically working through a queue of samples on a shelf. And then, nothing happened. Not for a long time. Washburn's samples sat in the processing queue for over a year. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab was working through the DNA collection effort in the order the samples arrived, and his had landed in one of the later batches submitted. 14 months passed between the day Robert Washburn signed that consent form and the day his sample was finally tested against the profile from Jennifer's swimsuit. A wall calendar with pages turning rapidly, spring 2017 to summer 2017 to winter 2017 to spring 2018. 14 months is a strange, almost cruel unit of time to sit with in a story like this. It's long enough that investigators moved on to other batches, other names, other leads, never knowing that the answer was already sitting in a lab queue, waiting its turn. It's long enough that Washburn himself, having voluntarily handed over his DNA more than a year earlier, had every reason to believe that chapter of his life was closed. And it's long enough that Patty Bastian kept living her life the way she had for 3 decades, hopeful, but with no reason to think that particular spring would be any different from the ones before it. A lab technician at a computer, running a comparison. A progress bar. A match indicator flashing green. On May 3, 2018, that comparison came back. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab notified Tacoma police. Robert Washburn's DNA matched the male profile recovered from Jennifer Bastian's swimsuit 32 years earlier. Investigators would later calculate the odds of a random, unrelated match at roughly 1 in 57 trillion, a number so vanishingly small, it functioned, for all practical purposes, as certainty. The man who had once called in a tip about a murder in the same park system, who had jogged those trails as often as twice a day by his own account, who had blended so completely into the background of this case that his name hadn't surfaced as a serious suspect in 3 decades. That man was the one detectives had been searching for since 1986. A dispatch radio crackling. Detectives moving quickly through a police department hallway, jackets in hand. Detectives moved fast. Within days, Tacoma police coordinated with authorities in Illinois. On May 10, 2018, Robert Washburn was taken into custody at his home in Eureka and held at the Woodford County Jail to await extradition back to Washington State. A small-town Illinois street, police vehicles parked outside a modest home, neighbors watching from front yards. In Eureka, Illinois, the reaction was disbelief. Washburn had lived there for years, an ordinary man in an ordinary town. The kind of neighbor nobody thinks twice about. For friends of the Bastian family back in Tacoma, the arrest brought back painful memories, but also, finally, a measure of peace. One family friend told reporters that the news wouldn't bring Jennifer back, but that something in her heart simply felt better, knowing the search was finally over. Washburn ultimately waived extradition and was transported back to Washington state to face the charges against him. A press conference at Tacoma Police Headquarters. Cameras, microphones, a family standing together at a podium. On May 14, 2018, Tacoma Police Chief Donald Ramsdell stood before reporters and confirmed what the city had waited 32 years to hear. Jennifer Bastian's killer had a name. Standing beside him were Jennifer's mother, Patty Bastian, and her sister. Patty thanked the department, thanked the community, thanked everyone who had refused to let her daughter's case fade into a filing cabinet. She said the thing that had carried her for 3 decades was simple. She never lost hope that this day would come. A packed press room, reporters holding recorders aloft, a row of officers standing at attention behind the podium. Chief Ramsdell told the room he had always believed Patty knew, somewhere, that this day would eventually arrive, that she had never let go of the certainty that her daughter's killer would someday be brought to justice. It was a sentiment that had defined the family's public presence for 3 decades. Not bitterness, not despair, but a stubborn, unwavering faith that the case would not stay open forever. Friends of Jennifer's, now grown adults with children and lives of their own, spoke to reporters that day too. One woman, who had been close with Jennifer as a child, told a reporter that for many of them, childhood had effectively ended the day Jennifer disappeared. It was a line that captured something larger than the case itself. The way a single act of violence can ripple outward for decades, shaping an entire generation's sense of safety long after the headlines fade. A courtroom sketch, a seated man in an orange jumpsuit, a judge's bench, a prosecutor standing. Pierce County Prosecutor Mark Lindquist charged Washburn with first-degree premeditated murder, adding aggravating factors of sexual motivation and deliberate cruelty. A legal move aimed at securing the most serious sentence available. We're almost at the end of this one, and if this story affected you the way it affected our team putting it together, that's exactly why we do this. Subscribe and turn on notifications so the next unsolved case we crack open lands in your feed the moment it's live. Washburn's mugshot dissolving into an old photograph of him decades younger, superimposed briefly, then fading. In court, Washburn ultimately admitted to what he had done. According to his own account, he encountered Jennifer while she rode her bicycle through Point Defiance Park on August 4, 1986. He grabbed her, dragged her into the woods, and strangled her. In a written statement to the court, he offered something resembling an apology, words that Jennifer's family did not find sincere, given that he had never once, in 32 years, come forward on his own. He did not come forward, Jennifer's sister told reporters afterward. He was caught by law enforcement. A gavel coming down. A courtroom sketch of sentencing. Robert Washburn pleaded guilty and was ultimately sentenced to 27 years in prison. Patty Bastian said she was relieved by the plea. It spared her family the ordeal of a trial, though she admitted she wished he had given them more than an apology. She wished he had given them answers. A quiet courtroom hallway after sentencing. Patty Bastian walking slowly beside her daughter, sunlight streaming through tall windows. At sentencing, Patty spoke about what the previous 32 years had actually cost her family, not in abstract terms, but in the specific, accumulating losses of holidays and birthdays that Jennifer never got to have, and that her family had to endure without her, year after year, decade after decade. It's easy, watching a case like this unfold in headlines and press conferences, to lose sight of just how long that grief stretched. 3 decades of ordinary days that should have included a daughter, a sister, and eventually, perhaps, a mother of her own. The guilty plea meant the Bastian family would never have to sit through a trial, never have to relive the details of that August afternoon in a public courtroom for a jury. For many families of cold case victims, that mercy, the ability to avoid reliving the worst day of their lives in exhaustive adversarial detail, is its own quiet form of justice. Point Defiance Park in daylight, peaceful, sunlight through the trees, a slow pan across 5 Mile Drive. Jennifer Bastian's case is, in the end, A story about patience. The patience of a mother who never stopped believing. The patience of detectives who kept a 30-year-old file alive through generations of new technology. And the strange, almost cruel patience of the evidence itself, sitting in a locker for 3 decades until science finally learned how to listen to it. It is also a reminder of how thin the line can be between a witness and a suspect. In 1986, Robert Washburn was simply a jogger who picked up a phone. In 2018, he was the man whose own DNA closed a case that had haunted an entire city. Split screen. One side, a bicycle leaning against a tree in the sunlit park. The other, an empty evidence room shelf where a swimsuit once sat sealed for nearly 3 decades. There's a particular kind of unease in knowing that the answer to this case existed, physically, for years before anyone could read it. The swimsuit that held the evidence was never lost, never destroyed, never even misplaced. It simply waited in a climate-controlled room for the science of DNA analysis to mature enough to unlock what it had been holding all along. In a strange sense, the case wasn't solved by a detective's hunch or a lucky tip. It was solved by time itself, and by the scientists who kept pushing the boundaries of what a single fiber of fabric could reveal. It's also worth remembering what this case cost before it was ever solved. The 24 days a community searched without knowing, the 32 years a mother waited without answers, and the more than 150 people who quietly gave up a piece of their own genetic identity so that one name, buried in a stack of old tip sheets, could finally be confirmed. Detective Lindsay Wade, who spent years rebuilding this case from the ground up, retired from the Tacoma Police Department just a month before Washburn's arrest. She would later say that solving this case, alongside the parallel effort on the still unsolved Welch case, felt like lifting a shadow that had hung over the entire city for a generation. For those who grew up in Tacoma in the years after these murders, the cases had become something like local legend, the kind of story parents used, half-consciously, to explain why certain trails were off-limits after dark. A slow-motion shot of an old photograph of Jennifer, smiling, sunlight catching the edges of the frame. After 30 years of unanswered questions, justice finally arrived. One tiny DNA sample proved that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still be uncovered. A wide, still shot of Point Defiance Park at golden hour, the trail empty, wind moving gently through the trees. Today, the trails of Point Defiance Park still wind through the same old-growth forest they always have. Joggers still run them at dawn. Families still picnic along the water. For most visitors, it's simply a beautiful park on the edge of the Puget Sound, no different from 1,000 others across the Pacific Northwest. But for the people who lived through that summer of 1986, and for the family that spent 32 years waiting for an answer, this ground will always hold a different kind of weight. It's a reminder that even the most ordinary places can carry the heaviest histories, and that even the coldest case can still, someday, find its way back into the light. Fade to black, text on screen, in memory of Jennifer Bastian, 1972 to 1986. If this case reminded you that no cold case is ever truly closed, that's the whole reason this channel exists. Subscribe now, tap the bell for notifications, and tell us in the comments which unsolved case you want us to investigate next. We read every single one. Thank you for watching.